Okay, well, my clock says 1:30, so maybe we'll go ahead and begin. I want to welcome everyone to the Retail Energy Marketing, or REM Fraud Coalition's third webinar entitled Navigating Retail Fraud in the Purchase of Receivables, or POR, Markets. Let's first start with just some housekeeping matters. I first wanted to remind everyone about the coalition's antitrust policy that everyone agreed to follow when signing up for today's webinar. Our antitrust policies are intended to promote competition in the retail energy market and encourage the development of best practices in combating fraud within our industry. Uh, I want to let you know you will be able to submit written questions during the presentation. It's just in the Q&A, so just write your questions and we will try to get to them either during the speaker's presentation or, if time permits, at the end. I also want to remind everybody that this presentation is being recorded and will be available later in case you want to view it again, or if you know someone who was unable to attend. With these few housekeeping matters out of the way, let's begin. We're going to first look at the agenda. Our last webinar focused on the Texas market and the experiences companies and other entities were having with fraud in the Texas market where there is no POR. Therefore, the logical next step was for our next webinar to present experiences and best practices on navigating retail fraud in other jurisdictions where the utilities have purchase of receivable, or POR. We're going to begin with a brief introduction to today's panelists. Our panelists will share their experiences and best practices from their own points of view. We will also discuss best practices for fraud prevention via the different sales channels, including the use of third-party verifications. And as I mentioned before, time permitting, we will take additional questions and we'll remind everyone of different options for them if they want to participate in the Fraud Coalition's ongoing efforts. I want to begin by introducing our speakers today and thank them in advance for graciously agreeing to share their insights into helping combat fraud in the retail energy market. I will note that each speaker has provided a short bio and their contact information in case you want to follow up with them after the webinar. My name is Madeline Kuchera, and my role today is simply to serve as moderator. I am president and founder of EarthEtch, with a regulatory and operational consulting firm that helps companies keep abreast of the commission's and utilities' ever-evolving landscape. Our first presenter will be Michael Gruen, who is an energy regulatory attorney actively involved in many of the POR markets. He will share insights into how commissions and attorney generals have viewed and dealt with deceptive marketing practices within the industry that impacts the regulatory environment today. He will share some best practices to help reduce fraudulent activities. Next slide. We are very fortunate to also have Rob Cantrell, whom many of you may know. Rob currently serves as Atlantic Energy's CEO and has decades of experience in the industry. So he seemed like an excellent choice to share his experiences actively trying to mitigate fraud within the industry. Our third speaker is Eduardo Flores, who currently serves as Vice President of Third-Party Verification at AnswerNet. Eduardo will share from his perspective some best practices and tips on reducing fraud within the industry with a focus on the use of TPVs. Next slide. Um, Michael Gruen is going to begin by discussing the impact of fraud in the regulatory environment. Michael, I'll now turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Madeline. Thanks for having me as well. My name is Mike Gruen. I'm an attorney with Stevens and Lee, and I represent about 24 retail suppliers in a wide variety of matters, mostly in the northeastern competitive markets. And I know that there are suppliers attending today that operate in both the POR and non-POR markets and have experienced the consequences of fraud firsthand. And I think it's accurate to say that the issue of fraud in POR markets may not have as direct of a financial impact on suppliers compared to some of the things we're hearing and seeing in Texas with the organized fraud rings. But fraud is still having a big impact in the POR markets. And that's because the persistence of fraud in these markets here in the Northeast is having a big impact on the regulatory environment and is resulting, frankly, in a shrinking marketplace for suppliers in these states. And the reason is simple, that the regulators they've stated it, they're on the record as saying they're fed up with fraud in the industry. And it's led them to take some drastic restrictions, impose some drastic restrictions that are frankly impeding the ability of legitimate suppliers to operate. So I just want to give you a couple examples quickly to show you how we can connect the dots between the regulators' frustrations with fraud, which resulted in the passage of tough restrictions on retail suppliers that limit their ability to operate or serve certain segments of the market. New York, as early as 2016 and before, they were on record publicly as stating that there's customer abuses going on in the marketplace, and they were not happy about it. The problem persisted. It did not go away. It didn't improve. The result was the 2019 reset order, which you may be familiar with, but it had drastic consequences on limiting the types of products that could be sold to mass market customers, and really reduced choice in many cases for customers. But that wasn't the end of it. I mean, the fraud continued, the complaints continued, the dissatisfaction continued, and in 2022, the legislature in New York got involved and passed what really is a bad broker marketing and licensing law that was intended to try to eliminate some of this fraud or deception or improper activity. But the reality of the way it was written, it went way beyond that and is really going to make it difficult, even more difficult for suppliers to reach mass market customers at all. Next slide, we can go to a similar pattern in Illinois. The Attorney General there in 2019 in May went on record as announcing a crackdown publicly against suppliers, saying that suppliers were using misleading and deceptive practices against the most vulnerable citizens in Illinois. He initiated some investigations, made some public statements. The problem didn't improve. The pattern continued, and the Attorney General took it a step further, and he actually advocated for a new law to the legislature there in Illinois that they passed unanimously, 116-0. This was the HEAT Act. And this changed the landscape completely in Illinois for the mass market customer. It ended low-income customer enrollment. It prohibited ETFs. It required suppliers to put the utilities price to compare in their contracts and on their marketing materials. It added new TPV restrictions and requirements and enacted a bunch of new and difficult and confusing contracting and reporting requirements. Again, all can be traced back to this problem with fraud that was never rectified. Go to the next slide, and I'm sure you're familiar with this. Some of you are, if you operate here in the Northeast. What's going on in Maryland? In Maryland, it's another example of the seeds being planted several years ago that are resulting in these really bad restrictions that are going to essentially make it impossible for suppliers to serve certain segments of the market. In February of 23, the commission in Maryland began a heavy focus on retail fraud. This is one of their you'll see on the slide, some of their concerns. They're on record as saying that suppliers in our midst are engaging in deceit, confusion, and trickery. They're not saying vendors of suppliers, they're saying suppliers. all of this blame is falling on suppliers. It's not a legitimate excuse to say, well, this is a vendor issue or an agent issue. From the regulator's perspective, it's the supplier's problem. They're saying this is fraud, this is deception. These suppliers have no business whatsoever supplying customers in Maryland. The PSC in Maryland cracked down on several suppliers individually, revoked some licenses, issued some fines, but that wasn't enough. It didn't stop. And earlier this year, the General Assembly enacted Senate Bill 1, which requires licensing of retail agents. It ends POR for residential customers. It places a ban on variable rates, limits on green products, and on, which is essentially is going to make it difficult, or if not impossible, to serve residential customers in the state of Maryland. And the common theme here is that the regulators put the industry on notice that fraud was a real problem that needed to be addressed, but no action was taken by the industry to eliminate the fraud. So the regulators became more and more aggressive and negative about the industry, and eventually enacted widespread rule changes that went far beyond just fraud prevention. And now we're left with markets that are much more difficult to serve as a result. And the lesson is, if the industry doesn't do enough to, on its own, stamp out fraud, the regulators will take action, and the resulting regulation is going to be one you don't like, and will likely go very far beyond what's even necessary to stop fraud. So it's not just about protecting your company. Next slide, you can get to the next slide. It's not just about protecting your company. It's really about protecting the viability of the industry in these markets. So for the next few minutes, I'd like to talk about some practical things that you as a supplier can do to prevent fraudulent sales. Next slide, please. So I've helped a number of suppliers implement these strategies, actually in connection with compliance plans that regulators ordered in response to investigations. And using these processes can demonstrate to regulators that a supplier is doing everything possible to prevent fraud by its vendors. The processes that I recommend fall into 3 general categories: before the sale, during the sale, and after the sale. So before you even begin selling in a state, you want to think about this from a regulator's perspective. What would a regulator expect you to do as a supplier to prevent fraud before beginning a sales campaign in their state? They're going to expect you to screen your vendors before engaging them. This means background checks on the company, its principals, its affiliates, etc. It means asking for references. It means asking the vendor to disclose information about investigations and lawsuits. It means visiting their call center and questioning them about their compliance practices. I recommend having a standard vendor onboarding process with multiple levels of review, not just from your sales team, but from your regulatory compliance team and legal team if necessary, and require these prospective vendors to provide you with this information before you hire them. The regulators will expect you to undertake that level of due diligence on the vendors if you expect them to accept that this fraud wasn't your fault, it was a vendor's actions. In addition, you're going to want to make sure that your contract with your vendor includes very clear compliance obligations. So if a regulator asks you for a copy of your vendor contract, they'll see that the vendors were expected to sell in a compliant way and that there were real consequences for acting improperly. The contract should include a clear set of the performance expectations and quality assurance requirements that is expected of the vendor, as well as financial disincentives for improper sales, such as commission clawbacks and indemnification provisions. The last item before the sales or the selling occurs is you need to have a clearly defined training program for all of your agents and vendors' agents. Too often suppliers leave training completely up to the sales vendor, and this is a major red flag for the regulators. Most states have very specific mandatory training requirements, and the obligation to conduct that training under the regulations is placed on the supplier who holds the license. So the only way to ensure the agents are being trained in accordance with these regulations is for the supplier to implement the training program and require the vendors and the agents to certify they completed it. The regulators, it's not enough to tell them that you have a training program. They want to see proof that the training actually occurred and was conducted. So those are the some of the elements of the before you begin selling phase that you should take to try to prevent fraud. But there's also steps that need to be taken during the sale and after the sale to identify and prevent fraud. So during the sale, as we know, there can be a significant lag time between the day a customer is enrolled and the day they receive their first bill showing the new supplier. And we've seen this lag time be exploited by unscrupulous sales agents. These agents are aware that from the time they do enrollment, it may be 3 to 4 months, literally, before the customer sees their first bill with that new supplier. Then there could be an additional 1 or 2 or 3 months that could pass before the customer recognizes an improper enrollment and files a complaint. So this lag time, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, makes it very difficult for a supplier to identify fraudulent enrollments and take actions to prevent the agent from committing more bad enrollments. So the key is real-time and near-time oversight. Even though you screened your vendor and signed a good contract with them and oversaw the training, the work to stop the fraud is really just beginning. You need to implement tools that will make it difficult for the fraud to be perpetrated and for you to identify the fraud. The specific tools will depend on your sales channels, and some of the other speakers here today are going to talk more about those tools. But these are the types of things that really are essential, and the regulators will expect you to have in place at this point to prevent against fraud. Along the same lines, the work doesn't stop after the sale. The regulators will expect you to do some proactive quality assurance to root out fraud. It's despite your best efforts to stop it, it's amazing what these agents will come up with to circumvent your safeguards. It really is. I've been doing this now for 15 years, and they still come up with new and better ways to beat your processes. So you need to do outbound calls and contacts to newly enrolled customers or sample them and do some auditing and analysis of sales to identify trends that might indicate fraud. If fraud is identified through a QA call or a customer complaint, it's not enough to simply fire the agent or have him removed from your campaign. You need to investigate all the enrollments done by that agent and take corrective action to cancel the improper enrollments done by the agent. The regulators will expect you to be proactive and take this action to identify these customers. It could be painful, it could be ugly, but you can't bury your head in the sand and pretend it was just a one-off or one bad enrollment. The regulators expect you to identify the customers who may be impacted and fix the problem. Next slide, please. So I think a couple of speakers will go over this today, so I won't beat this to death, but you're probably aware of the telltale signs of fraud, and you need to train your staff to recognize those telltale signs. Upticks in enrollments, enrollment rejections, quick cancellations, high churn. Pay attention to your customer complaints and what they're saying in those complaints. Don't just put them into a general category, bad sale or buyer's remorse. You need to look at these complaints and really see what they're saying and take these customers at face value to see if they're telling you that fraud's occurring. If the QA calls or reviews turn up strange sales calls, clipped sales calls, voices that don't match the TPV, obviously strong indicator of fraud. Another one we're seeing more and more, believe it or not, is you may be getting contacted by regulators or staff at regulators who say they've been contacted by an agent calling on behalf of you. This has happened to several suppliers in Ohio and Pennsylvania where these fraudulent agents unknowingly contacted staffers at the PUC at home and attempted fraudulent enrollments. And so once something like this happens, and you can take all the corrective action you like, it's hard to unring that bell. And once this happens and your name's associated with fraud to a regulator who was called at home, it's really, it takes a lot of work to get back on the regulator's good side. The last slide I have, you want to flip to that. I just want to leave you with some a kind of a playbook. If you suspect fraud, you should have a game plan in place in the event you detect fraud. The first thing I suggest is engaging with counsel to loop them in on the investigation and the internal communications. This will provide you a level of confidentiality to your investigation under the attorney-client privilege, and your counsel will then be in a better position to help you determine your options, both with respect to the vendor and your regulators. You need, when you suspect fraud, you need to thoroughly investigate the situation, identify the extent of the fraud and the exact methods used and how many customers were impacted. And once the number of customers impacted is determined, you need to develop a game plan to remediate that fraud, which could involve outreach to customers by phone, by letter, electronically. It could involve refunds. It probably will involve refunds, but you need to go into damage control mode at that point. And at some point, you need to decide whether you think you need to reach out to your regulator. Depending on, and this is a case-by-case, state-by-state analysis, but depending on the facts, the nature of the fraud, the extent of the fraud, it may be in your benefit to self-report the situation to the regulator. That might get you some goodwill, and it may be a preferable course of action compared to having the regulator finding out about the fraud through a customer or an investigation. Finally, you're going to need to decide what actions you can and should take against the vendor. You could have an indemnification claim. You might want to suggest a litigation hold of records. Obviously, suspension, firings, probation, all those things are on the table. But again, it's a case-by-case basis, depending on the facts on the ground. And finally, you're going to want to look at your processes to see what deficiencies there were that were exploited, what weaknesses that need to be patched, what extra efforts you can implement to prevent the fraud from happening again, and nip it in the bud. So that's really all I had. With that, I'll turn it back over to Madeline, and the next speakers will take it from there. If you have any questions about the legal or regulatory issues around fraud, or really any other issue in these POR states, please feel free to reach out.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. Michael, that was very informative. Next, we're going to turn it over to Rob Cantrell of Atlantic Energy, who's going to share his experiences and best practices from a supplier's point of view. Rob?
Thank you, Marilyn. I appreciate everybody's time and excited to be part of this group. This is kind of a fun slide that I put together. These are all of the companies that I have been a part of over the last almost 20 years. When Marilyn said it's decades, that S will come in about 4 months. So in February of next year, it will be 20 years for me in the industry. And so you may say, Rob, why are you not on a golf course right now? And there are 3 answers to that. Number 1, you haven't seen my slice and it is terrible, so I should not be on a golf course. Secondly, I love the people that I get to work with every single day. And third, I'm very passionate still about our industry. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about is fraud. I probably disproportionately passionate about it because I feel like it's stealing and I feel like it's wrong. So you'll see me spend a lot of time worried about fraud, talking about fraud, and trying to prevent fraud. Most of that I fought in Texas, but that is not the topic for today. The topic is fraud in the POR markets, which are mostly in the Northeast. So Tom, if you go to the next slide, please, that'd be great. My whole topic today is talking about balance. And so here are two of my executives here at the company. Paul Karam is our Senior Vice President of Sales, and Emily Sipes is our General Counsel. So she handles all the regulatory side, and Paul has to bring in all the sales. So for us as a company and for me as the CEO, it's a balancing act, right? Because we have to get sales. I mean, we don't have the advantage of an incumbent monopoly just be given our customers. And so there is, we have to go out and acquire customers, but at the same time, we have to do it under the regulatory framework and in a compliant way that Mike Gruen just talked about in his presentation. So it's always a balancing act between regulatory, trying to keep us, 100% in out of the gray area, and sales going, Rob, you're putting this pressure on me to bring in customers. How do we balance those two things? So if you go to the next slide, just some examples of those, right, would be sales channels, for example, right? Of course, my regulatory general counsel says, let's only do digital, right? It's customer self-service. They can click the buttons. They can, we know we got an IP address for everybody. The fraud there will be very low. And my sales guy, of course, is saying, we want to have door-to-door guys running everywhere. Let's do some telesales and all this other stuff. And so speaking of telesales, if you are still doing telesales in the energy industry right now, we're going to give you a Texas saying, bless your heart. Good luck to you if you are still doing telesales in this day and age. So most of the information that I'll talk about is around door to door. And for those of you that are spoiled like I am in Texas, where we love the online digital sales, really there is a much less digital shopping up in the POR markets up in the Northeast. And so really one of the only ways to acquire residential customers is through the door to door. So don't love it, but in this situation, it's a necessary evil. Some of the other things where you have to do the balancing is that, of course, Emily would want every sales agent to go through a 2-week intensive training, including, extensive background checks for them and their families and all the other stuff, right? While my sales guy is, slap them on the butt and tell them, good job, get out there and start selling, right? So there has to be a balance between the two. How much training do you have? What is enough? What type of certification do you want to give them? What do they sign off on? Those type of things. So those are what you have to do as a company, balance those two things. And finally, just again, as an example, demerits. Again, Emily would say, one strike and you're out. If I find you doing anything, you're off the campaign, and you're not gonna deal with you anymore. Paul will be like, well, how many sales did they give us last month? I mean, if this is a really good vendor, sure, they can have a couple missteps on there. Let's make it relative to their overall volume, right? So we always have to weigh these things as a company, as the CEO, on where is the line? Where do you draw it? Right. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges for our industry, but I'll give you some hints on maybe how to strike that balance a little bit later. But taking a step back for 1 second, just for our Texas folks that may not be as familiar with fraud in the Northeast, you may be thinking, is there no customer fraud in the Northeast? Do we not have the people using stolen identities or anything like that? And the answer is not really, because the billing relationship for the customer at that premise really remains the same, right? So what happens in Texas is you keep changing billing providers, you keep changing reps and never pay any of them, right? In the Northeast, in POR markets, you're just changing your energy supplier. You are still getting a bill from Pico or Duquesne or PP&L or whoever. So if you stop paying your bill, they're going to turn off your power no matter what. There isn't as much of an incentive, a customer incentive to have the fraud rings like we have in Texas. So when we talk about fraud in the Northeast, we're really talking about companies committing fraud either through their vendors or through, their day-to-day activities against customers. And that's what really gets the regulators mad, is that they feel like we're taking advantage of customers. And so that's what we'll talk about on the next slide, if we go to the next one. So the two types of fraud that we see in the Northeast, or shenanigans, as we'll call them, is the first one is performed by the vendors. So the salespeople. What will they do, right? What does fraud look like in these markets? Well, you'll find that the salesperson at the door or on the phone will impersonate the customer with the TPV. They'll use fake phone numbers. They'll use fake emails to do verification. They'll be recycling customers. In other words, they met Joe Bob 6 months ago and they use that same information and push it through the system with a new provider to sign somebody up. Or again, bless your heart, if you're doing telesales, they'll, just blatantly disregard no call lists and just call anybody on there, right? So these are examples of your vendor doing something to you, right? So the customer doesn't even know that they're being scammed in this situation. It's the salesperson not involving the customer. The other side of the coin could be that your vendor or the company will be basically lying to the customer, right? Or misrepresenting to the customer that this is a much better deal than what the customer is actually getting. So some examples of that are, pretending to be the utility. We've seen wild examples of that, of, guys showing up at the door with a utility shirt on, vest, hard hat, saying, I need to check your meter, things like that. People guaranteeing savings, right? We know that is a huge red flag for regulators and for companies. You're never going to be able to guarantee savings when there's constantly changing prices to compare and things like that. And just basically saying anything that you need to say to get the sale. The only really good thing about telesales is that the entire conversation is typically recorded, right? But on a door-to-door interaction with the customer, unless you've got body cameras on there, that you don't know what's being said on the doorstep, right? So it is sometimes the wild, wild west out there. A lot of times they say, we're just collecting information, right? And the customer is really not agreeing to do a switch or anything like that. The salesperson gets the customer's information and then performs a switch over. And finally, you can hear coaching on the TPVs. You'll hear the salesperson go, just say yes, just say yes, just say yes to everything in the background. And as our TPV friends will tell us in a later presentation, they have technology and stuff to prevent that now on and everything. But I just want to give everybody kind of the landscape of what it looks like, what types of fraud happen up there in the Northeast. If you'll go to the next slide. Mike mentioned a couple of these things, but these what I would say would be the big telltale signs, right? First, you start getting bad TPVs. So a new sales guy is only getting 20% of his sales through TPV or whatever. That's a really bad sign, and it's a leading indicator, right? Because if he starts with 20% getting through TPVs, it's going to be very hard for him the next day to have 90% getting through TPVs, right? So you want to use the bad TPVs as a leading indicator that maybe something is going on. The next thing would be unusual spikes in sales. And I know this is really disappointing to all the salespeople among us, because you work really, really hard to get those sales up. And then you turn around and you're like, oh man, we doubled sales this week. Well, guess what? It's probably fraud. I hate to tell you this, but I've been in this industry a long time, and you always have to, it used to be trust but verify, and now it's TPV and verify maybe, or whatever. But if you see a big spike in sales, you got to go investigate it, because it could be suspicious, right? As much as we want it to work. And then finally, we do, in addition to our TPVs and things like that, we do welcome calls. And so if you can start using that as a leading indicator as well, not doing a full TPV again, but just talking to the customer, talking to them about their their product that they've got, all that other thing. Very positive, welcome to our company kind of call, and it'll indicate you can start to see problem areas on those welcome calls. And if you can't get a hold of the customer, that's also a problem on those welcome calls. So let's go to the next slide. I know I'm spending a lot of time, and Marilyn's going to kick me off here in a second. Here are what I think are the keys to success for your sales channel. And Mike already touched on some of these, so I'll just go really fast. You need to have a thorough recruiting process. Make sure to check references. This is a small industry. Hey, who have you worked for before? Give me a name over there. I'll give them a call and make sure you guys aren't, criminals. Make sure that they've worked in energy before, because our rules and regulations are more stringent than a lot of other industries. So they may have been a great door-to-door team or telesales team in telecom, but now that you're in energy, the bar is a lot higher. And obviously, a lot of states require this, but it's also good practice everywhere is to do individual background checks on your individual agents. As Mike mentioned, extensive training. One of the things I think is very important in the training is to tell them what not to do. Like have that, don't ever say these phrases list, right? You think it would be implied when you give somebody a script, but people tend to go off script. So it's very important to give somebody a list of what you can say, but also make sure to give them a list of what they can't say. Very, very important. And then have them sign a code of conduct. A lot of people doesn't matter what they sign, but in this situation, they're at least putting some skin in the game that they're agreeing to these type of things. I always say have an itchy trigger finger. If there's a bad agent, it could mean a bad office. It could mean a bad vendor. Use a very defined demerit system. And if someone gets a demerit, there is mandatory retraining on there. And the final thing that I would say keys to success here is offer a good product. Right? Offer something that's compelling to the customer. I mean, maybe it doesn't have to be the cheapest price in the market, but it's got to be a reason for the customer to do it, or else you force your sales channels to be untruthful, right? If they can be truthful and tell a customer that this is a good deal, and it's the truth that it's a good deal, it's really going to eliminate a lot of the bad players and bad things that happen at that point of sale. Obviously, stay very involved with your vendors, talk to them constantly, every day, several times a week. Make sure that you've got your finger on the pulse of what they're doing. And my last and final thing that I would tell you is use carrots and sticks, right? If they get in trouble, get them in trouble. When we do our welcome calls, we track two things. We track whether the customer was confused and it's a do not enroll, but we also track whether they get kudos or not. Right? The customer will say the salesperson was very nice. They explained everything to me, everything. And we use the carrot and the stick on both. We'll bonus the kudos and we'll demerit the bad action. And I think that's important. It incents the right things to be done, and it just helps to improve your overall sales process. So that's all I got. Thank you guys so much. Sorry to go so fast. It turned out to be a lot more information than I thought. So you've got my email on the presentation. If anybody wants to reach out, chat, anything, love to trade old war stories and appreciate it. I'll turn it back to you, Marilyn.
Thank you, Rob. And before we go on, I did get a question, and I think you did mention that in the Northeast, you're not seeing a lot or as much digital sales. But I wanted to ask you, in your experience, one, is the digital sales safe from fraud? Or if not, what types of frauds do you see with digital enrollments?
Yeah, I just think that digital, even though it did grow some during COVID, we saw some increase in digital sales. We just don't see the widespread fraud that we see down here in Texas. Of course, if somebody can impersonate a customer on a phone call, they can always impersonate a customer online. But we just haven't seen it yet. Most of the digital sales seem to be, pretty, avoiding fraud during the whole process. So we haven't seen it yet. I'm sure as digital picks up and up, it could increase. But remember, there's a lot less incentives for customer fraud because of the POR markets. They're not changing billing providers. So if they're behind in their payments, they're still going to be behind in their payments, even if they switch over to us.
Right. And I was kind of curious, and I've heard from others, as you look particularly across the POR markets, we've seen a lot of increase and pretty substantial increases from years before in the POR rates. And I've heard that some of it's attributed from, the outcome of COVID, but just was wondering if you have any notion of what might be contributing to the increases in the POR rates.
Yeah, I'm almost sure that it's just customers' economic hardship, right? You've got general increases in energy costs, and the economic situation of a lot of customers. They're just having a tougher time paying their bill. I mean, we saw that in Texas, absolutely, when a lot of folks lost their jobs during COVID and things like that. People just had a really tough time paying their bill. And when they can't pay their bill, obviously the utilities go back to the regulators and say, hey, we need to increase this POR discount because customers aren't paying, right? And I think it's pretty played out with, you see commercial POR staying pretty low, but you see the residential POR go up a little bit. I don't think that's necessarily related to fraud, although a very small amount could be. I think it's more about just we haven't had the greatest economy, and folks have experienced some hardships paying their bills.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rob, and hopefully we'll have time for some general questions for the group. So with that, we'll want to thank Rob, and next we want to turn to Eduardo Flores from AnswerNet, who's going to share some best practices for fraud prevention, particularly, though, from a third-party verification perspective. Eduardo, I'll turn it over to you now.
Appreciate it, Madeline. I'll just kind of get right into it, and I'll touch on topics that Rob and Michael also brought up. So Eduardo Flores, I've been doing TPV for 15 years. I've had my hand in various TPV platforms, helped build some of the processes and some of the software as well. Not doing the work, but helping model it. So I'll go ahead and get started here with just really touching on what Rob was talking about, is understanding your basic KPIs, right? You as a supplier should know what good looks like, what great looks like, and what just is not realistic, right? If you get that unrealistic number over to your TPV provider, they can help monitor that for you. They can escalate those events or agents that hit that quota that just may not be as realistic. So regularly monitor agents' sales reports to identify unusual patterns, such as spikes in sales, understand the typical sales volume per agent on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. If the numbers seem too good to be true, they probably are, and you need to be notified about that. One of my mentors always told me is do the math to tell the story. In this case, the math, the TPV provider can send you that report or that alert, and then that'll help you tell the story. And understanding your KPIs is very important there. Next slide, please. This is an oldie but goodie, a VoIP check. Incorporate a check feature into your process to restrict the use of free services like Google Voice. I'm not talking about Google. I love Google. I'm just talking about general. There's a VoIP, non-fixed VoIP numbers that can be grabbed from the internet pretty much anywhere in the world, and there's no limit on how many numbers they can grab. So this helps prevent agents from creating multiple phone numbers, enhancing control over who represents your company and reducing the risk of fraudulent activities. Next slide. So implementing VoIP checks against all customer phone numbers helps identify those non-fixed fixed VoIP numbers, which are the red flags, which are often used by scam and robocalls. Approximately 5% of calls are stopped due to identifying non-fixed VoIP numbers in TPV. Now that number is going to be skewed if you're bringing on new teams, but if you consistently have a a team you trust, that's approximately the number that we're getting. So just talking a little bit about fixed and non-fixed VoIP numbers. The fixed VoIP numbers are actually linked to a physical address. So those are the ones, the Comcast business lines that you have in your office. Those are the fixed VoIP numbers. The non-fixed VoIP numbers are the ones that we really have to do a check on and make sure that you put a stop to those calls or at least review them. My recommendation or our recommendation is always to stop the cell on the non-fixed VoIPs. Next slide, please. VPN detection and prevention. So prevent fraudulent practices such as agents outsourcing work to offshore call centers. I'll give you the scenario here. A client hires a door-to-door team to sell door-to-door, and that team hires a call center 3,000 miles away to sell for them, right? So a VPN will detect that and has been very proven to make sure that those door-to-door agents are actually physically knocking on doors and not outsourcing the work elsewhere. In addition to a VPN checks, monitor IP masking tools. There's very vast amount of masking tools out there, such as proxy servers and iCloud private relays. If a VPN is detected in a non-applicable scenario, in our opinion, if you're knocking door to door, you should not have a VPN. But I get there's some security implementations that you have to go with. But again, our recommendation is not to have the VPN turn on if you're supposed to be knocking on doors. The client should be alerted if there is a VPN, or they can also choose to stop the enrollment until they turn it off. So they cannot submit for TPV until it's off. Next slide, please. IP address whitelisting. Ensure your agents are using this designated channels for completing sales, preventing any IP address manipulations. Register the range of IPs that you may be using. Manage approved DIDs. Restrict any sales only coming in from approved phone numbers. Controlling which numbers can represent your company helps prevent unauthorized and fraudulent activities. So it's important to manage those DIDs. Next slide, please. Here's my favorite part here. Capture as much visual proof in the door-to-door. As a best practice, gather as many visual proofs as possible during the enrollment process. This could include photos or customers' utility bills, ID, passport, any driver's license, any relevant information or documents that you want to capture in a picture. Take as many pictures as possible. One tip we always give our clients is to have the sales agent, the door-to-door sales agent, take a selfie at the door with the home number or the apartment number behind them. That's always going to help add just another layer. Ensure your TPV provider stores all the photos in the cloud and not on the agent's device. You don't want to give the agents the ability to upload images. You're going to get the same images uploaded potentially. So each image needs to be captured at the point of the TPV process. Next slide, please. Geolocation reporting. Monitor and control agent activity through geolocation reporting. Capture GPS coordinates from the agent's device. This enables precise distance calculations and can block calls and send real-time alerts based on the agent's location. Reminder, your provider should be able to send you those notifications or any reporting notifications via SMS, email, or however you prefer to be notified. Next slide, please. Geolocation fencing. Set up geolocation fences that require agents to stay within a specific distance from the consumer's home during the initial business. So initial sales submission. So they're supposed to be at the door, so they should be X amount of feet from the door. That number or that distance can be configured with your provider. On the other side of the coin, configure the fence to mandate that agents remain a certain distance away from the consumer's address during the TPV process. Some states mandate that they're not there once the TPV call starts. Initial estimates show that geolocation tracking, in addition to the existing fraud preventing tools, has increased fraud prevention or detection by 15%. And I believe that is all I had. Sorry to just slide through there, but I wanted to be sensitive to time.
No, thank you very much. And it actually leads to some questions that we've been getting. I guess the first question I wanted to ask is, and this is open to anybody who wants to answer it. I'd like Rob's perspective, Eduardo's, anybody's. But with the environment getting more difficult from a regulatory perspective, and for the sales channels perspective, do you see any the levels of sales fraud increasing, or is it staying about the same, or decreasing?
I think that's probably company specific, right?
Good,
You
good
know,
answer. Yeah.
when you're a new kid on the block, the vendors that tend to take advantage of you because maybe you don't have, you know, these great fraud prevention tools and TPV stuff set in place. As you get old and get the gray hair, you tend to learn to, you know, be able to know the tricks of the trade and do it. So I think it's hard for any one person like me or any other, you know, sales manager or anything to tell you whether they think it's increasing or decreasing. I think that it's always out there, and it's just a matter of how smart are you. A lot of times it feels like you just push them off to somebody else, unfortunately, instead of eliminating totally from the business, because there's always new guys out there that need new sales and need to do it. So I know that doesn't answer your question, but I think it's tough to gauge because you know, over time, certainly as a company, you're able to reduce it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the industry wide it's being reduced for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I would like to say it's decreasing, but I still see complaints coming in with
Yep.
clearly fraudulent sales being conducted. I got one today, as a matter of fact, across my desk. And
Hmm.
I think it's what Rob said, is there's this pressure and this balancing act between we need to, you know, make sales, defeat churn, increase revenues, but we want to be compliant. And if you're out there trying to start a campaign, there's only a limited number of potential marketers you can use. And if the top-notch ones are all engaged by somebody else, you find yourself going to the B or C teams, and that's where the
Right.
fraud is more likely to occur.
Yeah, and I'll add that, if you there's so many tools out there to do this type of fraud that it makes it easier for them to do it. Now, our job is to, I'm going to do a football analogy. If we keep going to the field with the same defensive schema or the same defensive strategy, and they can predict that, they're gonna find various ways to crack it, right? So our job is to start always adapt with the times and the technology changes. But we see a pretty consistent amount of fraud coming in.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. And I also was wondering, Rob had given a comment about telemarketing, and I forget if it was God help you or God bless you.
God bless you.
Bless your heart.
Yeah.
Bless your heart.
And
It's a loaded phrase, by the way.
wondering from Eduardo or Michael's perspective. I mean, I know I've been personally involved in some telemarketing cases, and I still have some nightmares from them. But your perspective, Eduardo, and then Michael, if you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think we see still a significant TM traffic. One of the things that we're trying to move or make a suggestion on is for automated QA. This will, allow the client to build models around what they want to catch in the recording from the sales start of the sale to the actual TPV, going through the whole entire journey, and then QAing anything that might want to be flagged as potential fraud or just a miscommunication. So that's kind of where I see this kind of going, as using our technology to improve that and help guard safe that transaction.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I still see suppliers doing telemarketing, and some are doing it effectively. I think the key is to do with the appropriate scale and scope. I think high volume, fast, crank them out,
Yep.
some good, some bad, but just throw as many up against the wall and see what sticks approach is not going to work. I have seen some suppliers have some success with dedicated in-house or outside small, focused, experienced teams who are willing to do a little bit more, spend some more time with the customers and a more of a tailored solution. That's been effective. And also kind of integrating a telemarketing channel with digital, with ads and phone calls out, and just multiple touch points with the customer.
Or digital ads that drive inbound traffic.
Yes.
Too,
Yes.
as well. That we've seen some examples of that, and that's, I think you eliminate some of the risk with the no call lists and things like that with those type
Correct.
of campaigns.
And with that, I'll add, be careful if you're in Maryland, though, where now they would view that reaching out to the customer and calling in as a telemarketing call, which, if I would have bet on that outcome, I would have lost a lot of money.
That's right.
But I think that we're getting kind of running out of time. So I would definitely like to thank all of our panelists. It was very informative, and we do have their email if you want to reach out to any of them. We'll just wrap up here. Next slide, just reminding everybody who the coalition is. We really believe by sharing best practices as we have done today, and by, pooling our resources and working together, we can achieve more effective and efficient outcomes. Drawing on our pooled resources, we can identify and stop fraud on a more broader scale than any entity acting alone. So we really do want to thank our participants and everybody who has participated. And there's many different levels. So let's go to the next slide. We continue to have people reaching out and saying, how do we participate? You can participate by, volunteering your time. Sometimes it's just helping the group identify what might be the next webinar we do. We may want to do surveys or just some research on things. Other folks may say, we will volunteer somebody to speak as a panelist. We also have people that have really done phenomenal job just promoting this and getting the word out that, we're having webinars or asking folks what kind of things they would like to see. So as I had mentioned earlier, we are going to post this to our website. So anybody who was not able to attend, please let them know that they will be able to see it. It'll probably be available on Monday because it takes us a while to process that. But other than that, really want to thank everybody. If you have thoughts on what you would like us to discuss next, or different topics, we are very open and welcome to that. We've done all of these based on input from others. So please let us know and reach out to us if you have any questions. We're happy and very appreciative, again, to our speakers, but also to everybody who participated today. Thank you very much. Bye. Everybody have a good rest of your day.